and welcome to the 4th episode of the Charcoal Selfie series. In today's class, I'm going to be breaking down the steps of how to use a black and white charcoal pencil to draw a nose on gray toned paper. And I feel like this is very commonly one of the most asked for demonstrations is how to draw a nose, because there aren't very many distinct lines or edges or details, because it's just such a rounded feature. So I am really excited to show you the steps of how to draw your own nose, and this is what it's going to look like on our skill building activity. We're going to be breaking down how to add in your white charcoal pencil highlights and how to smooth them using a Q-tip. Then we'll move on to adding our black charcoal pencil and smoothing that with our blending stump. So I'm excited to show you how to do this. It does really make a big difference to have an understanding of how to use value to create a drawing of a nose rather than just the idea of like drawing the outlines, because again, there are not very many solid edges that you find on a nose. So let's go ahead and get started. The first step is to use a mechanical pencil or a very sharp pencil to transfer our nose. And remember that there are not many solid outlines, so we are just doing our best to show those rounded edges and where our values change. Once you've transferred all of your outlines and where those value changes occur, we're going to begin, like always, with our white charcoal pencil, and we're focused on adding in our solid white highlights first. So I noticed that there was a fairly large oval highlight down at the tip of the nose, and then a longer skinny highlight along the bridge of the nose. Next, I worked with my Q-tip to help smooth out those highlights that I had added. And because noses don't have very harsh edges, we want these transitions to be very smooth all the way out to that gray tone of the paper. This step is especially important along the bridge of the nose, so make sure it's fading all the way out. For our next step, we're using the black charcoal pencil to fill in only our darkest areas, because remember, we will use our blending stump to create all of our medium tones. And in most noses, and in this example, our only dark, super dark value is in our nostrils. So I just filled those in and then switched immediately to working with my blending stump. And I use that to help spread some of that value around, starting with creating those outside edges of what's called the hood of your nostril. So that little part that's sort of sticking out over the top of the holes of your nostril. So I used my blending stump to go through and just work on adding the shading that is helping to distinguish that center part of your nose as a separate bump from the hoods of our nostrils and making them look like they are separate sections. You'll also notice that I used a scrap piece of paper to remove some of my value off of my blending stump when it started to get a little bit too dark. And that is a technique that is super valuable throughout this entire project, is knowing when to remove some of your value off of your blending stump to help you create lighter values. This is especially important when you are trying to transition out to gray quickly, like for example what I'm doing right now, where I'm trying to help it fade out to the gray before overlapping that white charcoal pencil, because remember, we always want to have just a little bit of a buffer of that gray tone paper showing through in between our white charcoal and our black charcoal. I worked on blending out that hood of the nostril just a little bit more, and then fading out the section that's in the center of the nose before working my way up to what's called the bridge of the nose, or essentially those longer sides. So I worked really hard to have a nice smooth transition all the way out to the gray tone of my paper, and I also decided to bring in some more of those darker values along the bottom of the point of my nose. And notice that it's almost like a little bit of a line, and I left a lighter patch underneath right before my nostrils. So there's just a little bit of a highlight there. I also decided to go back with my charcoal pencil and add a more distinguished line along the bottom of the hood of my nostrils. And that was just to make sure that those sections looked separate enough from the background. I continued to go back and forth between my blending stump and my charcoal pencil to help me build up these layers. So you can see now I'm working on bringing some of that value a little bit farther down and around the hoods of my nostril, trying to increase the dark value on the sides while not erasing or covering up those little highlights that are kind of showing that the edges of my hoods of my nostril are rounded. So I'm just going back through and continuing to add value. You should notice that throughout this entire process, I've had my reference photo directly beneath my actual drawing so that I can be looking back and forth from my drawing to my photo to make sure that I'm matching it as best as I can. This is a step that a lot of students really struggle to continue doing. They may actually start out doing a pretty good job looking at their reference photo, but as they start to get farther and farther in their drawing, I'd say that's when students really struggle to continue with that step of looking back at their reference photo to make sure that they're adding all of the details that they actually see. And this is a trick that your mind is playing on you because you've seen so many noses. So while you're working on this drawing, your brain is going to try and say, hey, we already know what this looks like. We don't have to actually look at that picture continuously. And it's really, really important that you do not listen to that impulse to just continue drawing on your own and coming up with your own sources of light and value, because looking at your reference photo is really the biggest takeaway that you should learn from this unit, so that you can draw things to look like what you are actually seeing rather than what your memory is telling you that you've already seen. At this point, I felt like I had gone back and forth enough with my blending stump and my charcoal pencil, so I continued to add some value up at the top, just really trying to separate out the bridge of the nose from the flat surface that is behind it. So I used my blending stump to add in some of those lighter tones and to really try to distinguish that edge without adding a solid line or too much value, because that's a mistake that students make as well, is knowing that your nose is raised, so adding almost a line in that section along the bridge of the nose. And this is how my nose drawing turned out. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this episode. Now, like always, I would like for you to come up and check your skill building with me to make sure that you've mastered these skills before moving on to more difficult ones. So what I'm looking for when you come up to check with me is first that you did not use just solid outlines to just draw around the outside edges of the nose, and that's all done using value, because like we talked about at the beginning of this episode, there are not many outlines that you actually see on a nose. I'm also looking to see that you faded from your highlight all the way out to the gray tone of the paper before adding in your black charcoal. Remember that the white and the black should not be overlapping. You should have some of that gray toned paper showing through. So if you do not, feel free to go through with a kneaded eraser and remove some of your values that are overlapping so that you can see that gray toned paper. I'm also looking to see that you used all 10 values to create your nose. So if I look over to your value scale, I should be able to see all of these values located somewhere on your nose. I hope that these steps were helpful and that you are feeling excited about learning how to draw a nose successfully. And I'm really looking forward to teaching you the mouth in our next episode. So I will see you there. Thanks for watching.